he's assassinated at, I believe, a wedding in front of his son
Yes, that's
Alexander.
right.
And Alexander is basically put at this point where the Persians are still knocking on the front door of Macedonia. He really doesn't have a choice here. He has got to take his 50 some odd thousand soldiers and turn and go continue what his father intended to, launch an assault on the Turkish, basically the Turkish coast of where these. So there were a bunch of Greek cities on the Turkish coast that were captured by the Persian Empire, and what Philip had planned was to essentially go out there and free these Greek cities that were under Persian rule, and that was, I think, it was the extent of his plan. So Alexander, takes this on, and this 23-year-old with his 50 some odd thousand men heads off into the Persian Empire, and the Persians don't really take him seriously in the same way that
They didn't.
the same way that the rest of the Greeks didn't take him seriously. So sure enough, like at the beginning of his campaigns, he somehow catches Persia, on their back foot, and he knocks them down. And before we know it, he's already well into Israel Gaza area, and you have some really big battles there where he almost kills Darius the Third. He even rides out in front of the army and throws that spear
Yeah.
at Darius, and Darius runs off, and eventually Darius is killed by his own people hiding up in the mountains.
Told Stone actually had a lot of great insight. We spent like maybe a half hour on Alexander the Great, and he was a guy who this year, like, I had really started studying a little more about.
Alexander?
But yeah, the conquering mentality that guy had, and the young age at which he set out to do it, and the short life he lived, but the scope of what he pulled off it's breathtaking. I mean, I don't think it's ever been. I don't think anything like that's ever been done since, before it, or it will ever be done again. I mean, we look at people who built huge empires and whatever over a much longer period of time, by the way, not to take away from their ability to conquer land, but
Not in 8 years.
dude, what he did for the time period he did it in, and the resources that they had in that time period compared to what you could do now with an army, absolutely fucking bonkers.
Yeah, it is. It is. So, within just a couple years, the king of Persia, Darius the Third, is actually killed by his own men. He runs off. He flees from Alexander the Great. Alexander chooses not to chase him because he's gonna get his army slaughtered if he does that. And in the meantime, Darius the Third, his men assassinate him, and now Persia is really unstable. And so, rather than pushing forward towards Babylon, Alexander makes the smart decision, and he turns south to capture Egypt, which you need if you're going to push deep into Persian territory. And, he kind of wipes Persia up and down clean just to establish, hey, within a couple years, Persia is already toppled. They already know he's coming for Babylon. He's going to capture the whole thing. But then after that, you got to go clean up every single little city who thinks, no, we're not going to give in to Alexander. And he's got to go knock him down. He's got to do all that. To fund all of that, you got to go get Egypt real quick. So he heads into Egypt, and the Persians flee, and boy, the gates open. The Egyptians are like, thank you so much for being here. They were glad that Alexander was there, or at least history tells us as such. Because Alexander's approach to it was, at least as it's told, is I'm Alexander, I'm Alexander, you're now free. That was the mentality. But obviously, he's conquering Egypt at the same time too. But he returns religion to Egypt, and he takes being the Pharaoh seriously. He loved Egypt, like all Greeks did. Greeks had admired Egypt. This is now
They were romantic.
This is 331 BC. The Egyptians have long revered Egypt for over 1,000 years before this point. And he had heard about Egypt in his favorite childhood book, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. And in there, Odysseus gets lost after the Trojan War in the Mediterranean Sea, and he lands on this island called Pharos Island. This is in Homer's writing. And so Alexander is intrinsically fascinated by this. And so while he's in Egypt, he goes to visit Memphis, and I believe on his way to the Sinai Oasis, where he's going to be, told by the by the high priest of Zeus Amun, which is this combination between a Greek and Egyptian god. That basically this is where he can go out to the Sinai Oasis, meet with this oracle. So you had an oracle in Delphi, Greece. You had another oracle, a Greek oracle. In Egypt that was out at this little oasis in the middle of the desert that he had to take this long journey to. And if he went and did this journey and he was proclaimed, the son of Zeus Amun, he could officially become Pharaoh. Something he had to do, So during this journey, he stops off on the northern coast of Egypt. Now, like we said earlier, the Egyptians aren't coastal people. They're not Mediterranean people. They're not really sailing out in the Mediterranean. They would do it for trade expeditions to get materials. They were doing that all the way back in 2700 BC, getting those cedars of Lebanon to put in the pyramids. But they're not, really sailors in the way that the Greeks have been for a long time now. So on that Mediterranean coast of Egypt, there's not a lot out there. And we're following Alexander's footsteps through this. We know exactly what was going on. There's so much literature at this time. It's amazing. We know more about Alexander. We can follow Alexander's footsteps through his whole life. We know more about him than we know about Jesus,
Yeah.
Just following his life.
Yeah.
There's huge chapters of Jesus' life that are just lost.
13 to 31, basically.
Yeah. And so we know that when Alexander, when he went out, he basically, what he wanted to do out of pure curiosity was go find Pharos Island that was mentioned in Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. And so he goes along the coast and he finds an area with an island that he thinks, oh, this must be it. And so on this little island was this little village called Rakotis, I believe. And it was really just a fishing village. That's all it was people who lived on the peripheral of Egyptian civilization, and they're just out there fishing every day. That's all they do. And they maybe pay a little bit of fish tax back to the government if the government ever comes around this place. You know what I mean? This is way, way out on the peripherals of Egypt, out in the middle of nowhere, basically. And probably what happened was that there is this story from the Bronze Age, because that's when, the Iliad and the Odyssey happened. If Odysseus, whoever this person is, really did arrive on the shores of Egypt, probably Pharos Island really means Pharaoh's Island. Yeah. And when he arrived, he said, what is this place? And his people said, Pharaoh's. This is the Pharaoh's place. Pharaoh means great house. It's, this place belongs to the Pharaoh. You're in the Pharaoh's land. So that's kind of where this loose interpretation becomes. And it's only, I don't know, 300 or 400 years after the Trojan War that Homer actually writes his Iliad and the Odyssey. So, you probably have this little bit misunderstanding of words here. Anyways, Alexander finds this island that he was looking for. And when he's there, it hits him. He had always wanted to build a city in his name, and he built like 10 Alexandrias throughout ancient history. Like there's a joke in archaeology, or in if you're studying classics and people say name 10 classic cities, you can say Alexandria, because there were 10 cities that he tried to establish. The only one that lasted was in Egypt, which was great because it's the best one. Alexander, being a Greek, he recognized the importance of building on an island and building next to big bodies of water, and how that could be a defensive structure. Because the Greek Isles, there's all these cities on these islands, and they're great. They provide great fortification. So he jumps off of his horse, and he's looking around for some chalk, and they don't have any. So he grabs some grain out of one of the saddlebags, and he lays down. He says, "This is where my city is going to be built. We have the Mediterranean Sea on one side. Mm-hmm. We have this great lake on the other side. We're going to build it right in this little strip of land." And he goes, "Where's some chalk?" And they're like, "We don't have any chalk." And so he grabs one of the grain out of one of the saddlebags. He starts laying the grain down. He gets on his knees, and he's like laying out the city. And he says, like, okay. The ocean breeze comes from this way. We're gonna build the roads where the ocean breeze will cool the people down, because it's freaking hot in Egypt. So we're gonna concentrate. The air to tunnel down these alleyways to cool the people down in the city. He's like laying out for this paradise, and he's telling his viziers or his architects, write this down. So they're writing it down and everything as he's laying out in chalk. And all of a sudden, these seabirds, they come up and gobble it all up in front of him, and just ruin his plan. And he's very distraught by this bad omen. And his right hand guys, like Ptolemy, who's his best friend, basically reassure him, and they say
he was more than a best friend.
Well, I think you're thinking Hephaestion.
Oh
Yeah,
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 that's
yeah.
right. That's right. I got it backwards.
So Ptolemy, that was probably strictly platonic, because Ptolemy, he ended up having a wife and all that good stuff later on. Um, but all of his friends tell him, this isn't a bad omen. What this is telling you is that the city that you're going to lay out is going to feed many nations. It's going to feed people for generations to come. That's what these seabirds gobbling up the grain that you laid out for your city. That's what that means. It's a good omen, not a bad omen. So it kind of reassured him. Well, he leaves his architects there. He leaves a part of his team there in Alexandria, and he's got the whole power of the Nile behind him. And he's saying, "Get started on this city." So Alexander moves on. He goes out to the Siwa Oasis, becomes pharaoh, and then he heads off to conquer the Persian Empire. During this time, we don't know how much, but the laying of the foundations of the city of Alexandria has begun. It's probably moving rapidly. And so, that's 330. That's the spring of 331 BC, and Alexander dies 8 years later, or in 323 BC, Alexander dies. And when all of his men are standing around him and they say, "Who should your kingdom go to?" And he says, "To the fittest," and it dies. And then they all have to fight over, well, what does that mean? So eventually it gets sorted up among all of his friends, and his best friend, other than Hephaestion, his best platonic friend, I should say, because he had obviously shown so much interest in Egypt while they were there. Ptolemy was very into Egypt. He was gifted Egypt to be the overseer of Egypt. Well, all, I don't know, 7 to 10 of Alexander's friends overseeing all the different portions of his empire eventually turned into what we call the successor wars, where they're all fighting against each other. And when Alexander's Macedonian empire eventually breaks into all these different kingdoms, well, Ptolemy really has no choice now but to become Pharaoh of Egypt.